Hello, and welcome to Griffin Baptist Bible Study. I'm Gary Wools. I will be the teacher. Today we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel, chapter 5. But before I get into the chapter, I want to give us a little recap of what we've covered in the first 4 chapters. In chapter 1, we were introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we saw how these 3 took a stand for God and how God rewarded them for their stand. In chapter 2, we learned about the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar had, and we saw Daniel interpret the dream. Chapter 3, we talked about the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up on the plain of Dura. And again, we see the 3 Hebrew boys, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, refused to dishonor God. They would not bow down to the image nor worship the false gods of Nebuchadnezzar. And as punishment, the king ordered them to be thrown into a fiery furnace. He wanted to watch them be burned up, but only to see God preserve them alive. In chapter 4, we saw how the Lord dealt with Nebuchadnezzar, which resulted in him making a profession of faith. It is my belief that King Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven today, just like the born-again believers that have gone home to be with the Lord. But before we start this lesson, we must have some background to both the political conditions that existed inside the palace and the physical makeup or structure of the city. As we begin chapter 5, we'll see Belshazzar is now king. But for a little history, Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon in 626 BC and ruled to 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, his son, became king in 605 BC after the death of his father, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar ruled 44 years and was succeeded by his son, evil Amaduk, upon his death in 562 BC. Amil Marduk reigned for 2 years, 562 BC to 560 BC, and was murdered by Negal-Sharezer. Negal-Sharezer was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar and reigned from 560 to 556 BC. Negal-Sharezer died and was succeeded by his young son, Marduk, in 556 BC. He only reigned 2 months and was murdered by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. Nabonidus reigned from 536 BC to 539, and he was another son-in-law of King Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus did not spend much time in Babylon, and his son Belshazzar was the regent, even though he referred to himself as the king. You might ask if King Nebuchadnezzar had any enemies. I believe there was a little political ambition within Nebuchadnezzar's family, not including his governors and others. That gives us a look at the political conditions that existed. Now we need to know something about the city itself. Babylon was situated on both sides of the Euphrates River, about 30 miles southwest of modern Baghdad. The city was surrounded by massive walls, and 9 massive steel gates protected the city from entrance from the river. The inner wall was over 7 feet thick, and the outer wall was about 4 foot thick. The walls were believed to be impregnable because they were so wide Several chariots could drive abreast upon them. The part of the city that lay on the east side of the river was known as the Ancient City and contained the king's palace and many pagan temples. The main palace stood just inside the Ithar Gate and covered approximately 13 acres. The sprawling complex included staterooms, royal quarters, garrisons for the royal bodyguard, storerooms, and administrative workplaces. The palace consisted of 5 sections, and each section was grouped around a courtyard. A courtyard measured 218 by 180 foot and stood in the center of the complex, and a throne room 170 by 56 feet has been found adjoining this courtyard and may very well have been the place or the room where the events of chapter 5 took place. The city is also known for its terraced hanging gardens. Those that lived in the city felt secure that no one could get inside the city. The time between the death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 and the end of the Babylonian Empire is only 23 years. Now we have some idea of the conditions at the time of this event, so let's get started with chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the thousands. Nabonidus was the king, but he did not spend much time in Babylon, like I said. Very little is known about him other than a reference found in a fragment of a scroll in Quran. This fragment indicated he suffered from a dreaded disease of the Most High God and was set apart from men for several years. This is not the same event, that of Nebuchadnezzar, that type of illness. In the 3rd year of his reign, Nabonidus made his son Belshazzar the regent and placed him over the affairs of the empire. Even though he was not the supreme monarch, it was not uncommon to refer to the person filling the position as the king. Belshazzar gave his drunken feast even though the Median army surrounded the city. He had invited 1,000 of his lords or friends, along with many wives and concubines, to this feast. He drank wine before thousands probably means that he got drunk. Verse 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Now notice Belshazzar is listed as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and this is because they did not have a word for grandson, which he really is. The more Belshazzar drank, the more he lost his mind. Nebuchadnezzar would have never desecrated the things of the temple, especially after he became known to know the Lord as his Savior. In a drunken stupor, Belshazzar orders the vessels that were taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar to be brought to the banquet hall so everyone could drink from them. Belshazzar would have grown up in the palace and would have known that these were holy vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And this is a record of the things that were taken. You find this in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 13. And he carried out thence all the treasury of the house of the Lord, and all the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. I don't think Nebuchadnezzar held a candle to Belshazzar when it came to pride and arrogance, even though he had his own moments. One part of the siege was carefully planned to do. Like I said, the Medo-Persian armies had the city under siege, and they had it for several months. One part of the siege was a carefully planned diversion of the Euphrates River into a channel that was being dug by the Medo-Persian army. This banquet was being held in defiance to this siege. Also, the commandment to bring the vessels, so he and the thousands of his lords and friends, along with many wives and concubines that he had invited to the feast, could drink out of them, showed his disregard for God and his arrogance. Verse 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. The servants now bring the vessels that had been taken out of the temple so they could use them. With total disregard of the things of the Lord, they drank wine out of these vessels. This is a major mistake on the part of Belshazzar, because you do not desecrate the holy things of God. Verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass and of iron, of wood and stone. Now Belshazzar and his crowd get so drunk that they, after using these vessels, they mock God by worshiping idols while drinking from God's very own vessels. Remember, while this is going on outside, the Median army is out there preparing to take the city. But all inside the city believed that it would not happen, and sooner or later the army would get tired and just go away. Believe me, God does not let things like this go unpunished. Verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw part of the hand that wrote. You want to venture as to whose hand he was seeing? Since God is a spirit and no one has seen God, I believe this hand was the hand of the pre-incarnate Christ. Like I said, archaeologists have unearthed a room and throne on the site of ancient Babylon that was plastered and measured 170 feet by 56 feet. And they believe this might very well be the hall where these events took place. Notice, Scripture gives us details about the room, and notice the similarities to the one that was found. These fingers now start writing on the plaster wall over next to the candlestick, and the king sees the fingers writing on the wall. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against the other. You've heard about being scared out of your wits? Well, I believe this might very well be a case here. A short time before, the king was probably so drunk he could not hardly stand up. And now I believe he's sober but cannot stand up because of the fear. His knees are shaking so bad they're hitting each other. The king's countenance was changed. The phrase, so that the joints of the loins were loose, may mean he went to the bathroom in his pants also. He probably was laughing and drinking with abandonment, but now fear replaces his party spirit. Verse 5, the king cried aloud to bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now the king calls all his pagan wise men. We've seen this before. Nebuchadnezzar did this twice before he came to the saving knowledge of the Lord. Belshazzar now offers a reward of scarlet clothing, a gold chain, to the one that can interpret the writing. Also, he says he will make them the third ruler in the entire kingdom. Why not the second? As I said before, Belshazzar was not the supreme monarch, and it was not uncommon to refer this person filling that position as a king. Belshazzar was the second ruler. He was the regent, not the supreme monarch. And I'm going to stop right there. We will pick up the second session with verse 8. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I didn't bore you to death with the opening and giving a recap and a description of the political conditions and the physical conditions that were there. And I hope you have a blessed day.